Hi, I'm Amy. Thank you for tuning in. Today I'm joined by the brilliant Gwendolyn Kiste, who is the author of one of my new favourite books, The Reluctant Immortals. It's one of those books that when I read the blurb, I knew immediately that I had to have it. And luckily, when I reached out to Gwendolyn, she wanted to have this conversation with me. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I was just mentioning to Gwendolyn before we hit record that it's really interesting to talk to an adult vampire author because, as people watching this know, I write young adult vampire books, and I think that it's really interesting, like, to look at the different dynamics of those, the different themes you can cover, so we can get into that in the conversation. But first, will you tell us a little bit about The Reluctant Immortals?
Yes, so it is the story of two forgotten Gothic literature characters, Lucy Westenra from Dracula and Bertha Antoinetta Mason from Jane Eyre, and they are they're the reluctant immortals of the title, living in 1967 California during the Summer of Love, when Dracula and Edward Rochester make a very sudden reappearance in their lives.
As soon as I read that blurb, I loved the fact that you redirected those stories towards to telling the female story and, like you said, the story of the two women that were kind of not given the best ending, either of them, in their books. So what was it that gave you that initial idea to tackle these stories we know really well from their point of view?
You know, I've been a fan of both stories, obviously, ever since I was young, and I just loved Lucy and I always wanted her to live. I always wanted to have more from Lucy growing up. And the same thing with Bertha from Jane Eyre. We don't really get a lot from her point of view, really at all, in the original book. And so it was just like, I was always like, what is her story? How would she tell this story very differently than how Edward tells her story in the novel to Jane? And it stayed with me for years and years. And then I wrote a short story called The 8 People Who Murdered Me, excerpt from Lucy Westenra's diary a few years ago, that was a short story from Lucy's perspective. And I just realized I just wanted to tell more from Lucy's point of view. I just loved it so much. And then I thought, this would be a great opportunity to also write about Bertha from Jane Eyre and just kind of put them together, because they have a lot of similarities, even though maybe at first that doesn't seem like it works. But then, like you see, they, like you said, they both got not great endings in their original stories. So it was nice to be able to kind of reimagine them.
Yeah, I love the way you sort of paired them as this unlikely friendship, and how you developed their characters. And I was interested because they already exist in literature. How did you develop them as characters? And did you take many of their traits from the books, or did you have to invent a lot of it yourself?
I really did try to go back to the original novels and really look at those and say, what do we know from them, and what do we believe that we are being told about them, as opposed to like Bertha, which you aren't really sure how much of it's true, how much of it's just her being called the mad woman in the attic, and how much she really was. And so really looking at what's there and sort of, extrapolating from it and saying, what else can you do, or what do I think could be going on sort of in the subtext of these stories about these characters, and how also would they change? Because, we all change over the years, and they've obviously been alive a very long time at this point. So, how would they change from their experiences, and just trying to build on that.
Yeah, I mean, the author I was talking to earlier is a middle grade vampire author, and obviously I write young adult. And I was just wondering, what do you think is the different stories that we can tell when you're talking adult audience versus young adult and middle grade? Like, how do you think that shifts? Because I was just thinking about our three books are so tonally different, and yet we use those same vampire rules at the core. The vampires have similar strengths, weaknesses. So what makes yours an adult book, mine a young adult book, and Alex's like a middle grade book? Like, what's the difference?
I know, it's so interesting to me, because it's like, I think that they can play on similar themes. I think the themes can absolutely be the same. For me, when I think about the difference between the middle grade to young adult to adult, a lot of it's just the age of the characters. I mean, to me, that usually, and even that isn't necessarily true, because some young adult and middle grade books have mostly adult characters. That can happen too. But I think it's just, that's the main difference, I think, but there, and maybe just how I don't even want to say how deep you explore the themes, because it's like, I think all of them can go every bit as deep on exploring themes. So I think maybe it's just that maybe as an adult author, I can use a couple more like curse words if I want to, maybe that's like one of the things, maybe it could be a little bit racier, but that's probably about it. I feel like they're very similar. I really do. I actually think all of them are really working from the same, like you said, we're using a lot of the same rules for vampire lore, and we're really all pulling from that same kind of primordial vat of inspiration.
Yeah, and I think maybe you think about the sort of sensibility of the age of your characters as well, because middle grade, it's kind of, oh, it's so fun to be a vampire, but maybe I don't want to bite people. And that tends to be the kind of like the things the characters are grappling with. And I think young adult vampires, it's like, oh gosh, now my girlfriend's human. What am I going to do? Type thing. Like I want to bite her. And then maybe the adult version, is it thinking a little bit like more about mortality and what immortality means and I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know when I was a teenager that I was thinking about those big kind of existential things as much that I think about now in my 30s. Like, I don't know, is
Yeah.
that anything? I don't know whether that is something consciously I did when I was writing my YA book, but I don't think I went kind of there to my adult
Yeah.
brain.
Yeah, I like that. I think that that's a great way of thinking about it because I do think at each point in our lives we are thinking about slightly different things, and that probably is a good point that it is more of that kind of existential question of what does it mean to be immortal? You're not
Yeah.
necessarily thinking of that. I know when I originally was young, I wasn't necessarily thinking when I think of vampires, it would be like, do you want to bite people, like you said, or don't you want to bite people? But then as I've gotten older, I'm like, wow, immortality would be that's a long time to be alive.
Yeah, it is,
That's a
especially,
lot of
yeah,
considerations.
if you're lonely as well. Like somebody asked me the question, like kind of a jokey question of like, what will you do if you're a vampire? And it's like, well, actually, I have a 2-year-old, so that's a really difficult question because like at some point am I going to turn him to a vampire? Like at what age do I do it? Do I ask for his consent? And we just suddenly got into this big discussion. I was like, wow, that is as a teenager, it's like, sure, I'd be a vampire. Yeah, go for it. But actually there's things
Yeah.
to consider, isn't there, when you're an adult? So yeah, I
Yeah.
really liked that. It did make me reflect as I was reading it. It's like it just has a slightly different tone and it's still got, things that are really fun and light, but then it's sort of got this dark kind of underpinning as well.
Mhm.
And another thing I was really interested in was at first I kind of assumed that all of your immortal characters were going to be vampires. And you actually went, I don't think this is too much a spoil to say that for some of the characters you went in slightly different directions. So I was wondering, kind of two-part question, how did you decide on your vampire mythology? And how did you decide on your kind of own mythology, which I found really exciting and kind of different from what I've read before?
Yeah, so with vampire lore, I just love that there's so many different rules you can pull from, and you can always just build your own too. And so, really looking across different versions of vampires that I've encountered over the years in literature, in film, and really saying, what works for my particular world? What are the rules that will make the most sense? What can I kind of look at and say, oh, here's something that I can work in with the overall theme or the plot that would really work kind of for the book rather than against it and rather than making it just kind of another obstacle. But it's good to have tension and it's good to have obstacles, but it's always good when they work with your plot as
Yeah.
opposed to against your plot. So that was one of the really big considerations, and also playing with the fact that a lot of the rules that I think people sometimes associate with Dracula didn't necessarily come from Dracula. He could go out in the daylight. He was just didn't have that many powers. And so kind of playing with that as to how to integrate some of the things that came from Dracula, some of the things that didn't, and kind of point out how this is like a continuing lore. And then in terms of not all of the characters are vampires, I did want to distinguish that maybe there are different ways to get to immortality and how that would affect the characters and how that could be yet another challenge of like Lucy is one kind of immortal and then Bertha, who goes by B in the book, is a different kind of immortal, and so they have different things that are kind of playing into what their powers are, what their weaknesses are, and they sort of have to work together to try to really maximize what they can do and help each other with the ways that they're sort of their challenges and everything.
Yeah, I like the fact that you draw on the challenges of the things that had happened to them in the books that they've been in, that they have fed into the situation of them being two women together who've had very different stories, but who've been traumatized by it. I thought that was really beautiful. And I think their friendship and their characters was just like one of my favorite things to read the book. It was so good.
Aw.
So another thing that I was interested in, I mean, I always think with vampire books, like quite a lot of them are modern, then you get the really kind of historical vampires. And with ours, I think we both picked a specific time period. So I went for 1995 because it was the year after Into the Vampire came out, the movie, and I kind of wanted to explore that whole like sensationalism of vampires versus the fact that they'd actually be serial killers if they're in the real world. So that was where I went with that. And also 1995 was the deadliest year in New Orleans history up to that point. So something like 470 some people were murdered that year alone, which I found terrible. And I thought, imagine if that was vampires. And of course, my brain went with that, and that's where my book came from. And I wondered, what was it about the particular time period of your book? Was the 70s? I can't remember exactly which.
1967 was.
Oh, 67. Sorry, I'm so terrible with that. I think anything before the 80s, I'm like, it all kind of blends into one. So was there a particular reason that you went for? Was it more about the decade, or was it that particular year that there was a reason for it?
It was both. I think the 1960s were such an interesting time. They were such a tumultuous time. There was so much political change. There was so much social change. And so I was definitely drawing from that. But with 1967 in particular, that was the summer of love in California, in particular in San Francisco. And I always thought that was interesting because it's like, I think a lot of people think of like 1969 with Woodstock, with the moon landing, that's sort of, and especially like in America, that's kind of the cultural consciousness of the 60s. And I remember when I was younger, I actually thought the summer of love was that summer. And it wasn't until a few years like after looking into the 60s that I was like, oh, it's actually 1967. It was when a lot of people just descended on San Francisco. And there were just a lot of people that were very young and just like looking for this, looking for something. And so I always thought that would be such an interesting time period to sort of go back to and see what it was like. And so when I went to write this, I thought, I already know a lot about the 1960s. I've been researching it, off and on since I was a teenager because I just think it's so fascinating. And then I thought that would be such an interesting point, and also kind of the irony of it being the summer of love when it's like they obviously are not in love with these terrible men who are awful to them, and kind of like playing with that kind of overarching theme, but then also just how much you could go to some place like San Francisco in that summer and kind of blend in. Even if you are somebody who's like a vampire, you could potentially blend in during that time because there were so many people who were outsiders, who were transients almost, that were just moving in for those few months. So it seemed like an interesting place where a lot of different people would come together. And that just seemed like, just a really fun place to put them.
Yeah, I think for somebody like Dracula who sees people as quite disposable, and unless he's fixated on you, you're just a food source. So yeah, I thought that was really clever and quite terrifying actually, that people could just disappear from there, and kind of their families, as far as they're concerned, they've already disappeared anyway. So they've done some of the work for Dracula.
Yeah, it seemed like a really scary time period for that reason. Like you said, like that's what even as I was writing, like people could easily disappear. A lot of them left home and maybe their parents knew where they went or maybe their families didn't. And so it's like if that person goes missing, especially in the short term, no one's going to necessarily notice. They're just going to think that they moved on to the next city or moved on to a different part of the neighborhood. So that was actually really scary to me. So I was like, wow, this really would be perfect for somebody who wanted to do terrible things. So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? That you can start writing something and then realize actually the further you unpick it, the better it seems to fit your world, because it just all kind of came together beautifully. And you mentioned about Dracula and Rochester. I was just wondering, what was it like to write those characters? Because they are so known and they've often been so kind of glamorized and they're so beautiful. And when I think of like the Buffy versus Dracula episode, they did like a kind of like making Dracula a bit of a ridiculous character. So, but you kind of peeled back the layers and showed the unpleasantness. Like, what was that like to write? And I was just wondering about that decision to make them kind of repulsive and sexy, sort of, but mostly repulsive, if that made any sense.
No, I like that. Yeah, because there still is an appeal of both of them, even in the context of the book, and certainly in the context of kind of culture, pop culture. I mean, I feel like both of them, like you said, are often considered very romantic figures. And so I've always, especially Dracula, I've always been like, he would scare me. Like, even as a little kid, I was never like, oh, this is romantic. I was always like, oh, he scares me. Like, he totally freaks me out. And so, I mean, that's really where I came from with Dracula. I don't think there's ever been a single version of Dracula that I personally found romantic. I always found him like scary. And now with Edward Rochester, when I was younger, I did think Jane Eyre was a lot more romantic. And I always say there's still a part of me that considers it romantic, even though I'm like, no, that's really toxic. His relationship, obviously, with Bertha is terrible. And obviously with Jane isn't like great either in a lot of ways. So for that one, it was actually kind of pushing back on a lot of the things that I felt like I grew up with, and a lot of the ways that kind of, that romantic Byronic figure that he is in the novel. And I thought that would just be fun to push myself too, because like I said, like when I was younger, I'm like, oh, Jane Eyre's so romantic. And then I'm like, but it's kind of toxic too. And so being able to play with that and you know, I love both books so much and I love both stories so much. So it was fun to go in there and be like, okay, what kind of perspective can I do with this? Like what can I do and kind of play with this a little bit in a way that in some ways we've seen it and in some ways we haven't, and kind of find the direction that I wanted to go with it.
Yeah, I think I mean, I definitely haven't seen it done like that because you needed them to be appealing enough that these young women would be drawn to them, because that's the whole thing you're trying to convey, that these women would kind of do anything to be with this person or be immortal. So I thought it was very clever that you kind of, there's a lot of like back and forth with that, where, I mean, obviously the man of the novel for me was, is he called Michael? My memory's so terrible, but the one who was interested in Lucy. I really liked that he was kind of the breath of fresh air, like the human man who was like the redeeming kind of character of the book, in sense of, you know, relationships with Lucy. And what was it like to write him as one of the few kind of mortal main characters of the book?
Yeah, you know, I definitely, because there is a lot of toxic masculinity in the book, I didn't want every male character to be like a total jerk, because then that almost becomes so one note throughout. So with Michael, I really did want to have this character that had, he's just come back from war, he was drafted, so you have that element of the 60s of like the people who were victimized in different ways. And so I really wanted to kind of draw that into it, and then also have somebody who's got his own kind of trauma, and you know, pair him up with Lucy and have them kind of going through the book together. And that was a really, that he was a lot of fun to write, because like you said, he is one of the only mortal characters, and he is a good person, like he's a decent person, and he's just trying his best throughout the book. And it was nice to have him as being kind of such an opposite to Dracula, and Dracula like immediately dislikes him because like they're such opposites, and like Dracula still wants Lucy's attention and Michael has Lucy's attention. So it was interesting to have like, and that was something that very much happened on the page of, I didn't go into being like, oh, Dracula would be jealous of this person, but as I'm writing, I'm like, Dracula very often in the different adaptations can be kind of petty. He's petty, and like I could see him being like, oh, somebody's taking attention away from someone that I want their attention of, that he would get angry about it. And it seemed like a really interesting push and pull to have there, so that was really fun to write.
Yeah, it was fun to read as well, and I think the corrupting influence of immortality, and he was kind of this pure like counterpoint to that. I thought that it was really nicely done. And I wondered, did you name him after Michael in the Lost Boys, or was that complete coincidence?
I didn't, but that's a really good, see, I like that. No, I didn't, but I love the Lost Boys. So maybe somewhere in my head that was there. Maybe, like, actually, yeah. Now that you say that, maybe, because that actually would work on some different levels. So I like that.
I think we vampire fans like to read between the lines of stuff, because like people were picking out like Buffy references in my book that I didn't think were there. I was like, maybe I've just stolen from Buffy without realizing it. So did you consciously draw from any more modern vampire material, or do you think that that's just become so much part of your like vampire psyche that
it's probably become more part of the kind of vampire psyche, because most of it was the original books, and then Hammer films. I definitely was drawing some from the aesthetic in particular of Hammer films. I was really imagining in particular their house at the beginning in Los Angeles is looking like a Hammer set in my mind. That was what it looked like, those beautiful ornate sets from the old Hammer movies. And so, but yeah, I feel like that's the main, those were the main influences I was drawing from. But yeah, probably a lot of things got in there, because like you said, there's so much with vampire lore, and I feel like we're all drawing from it as we're writing it, you know, and that's fun. I think I love how vampire lore has become almost like a kind of folklore, fairy tales that we can all just keep reimagining, and there's such a familiarity for all of us, and it's such a neat thing.
It's clever, isn't it? How like different authors. I read a book recently which touched about werewolves that's behind me, called Big Bad Me. It's coming out in October. It was really good. But there were vampires in it, and she used one of the vampire tropes. I don't think it's too much of a spoil to say, you know, the one about dropping like small things and they have to bend over to count them. And yeah. I've never seen that in a book, and I was like, oh, that is so clever to like in a modern. So just when I think that they've all been exhausted, there's something out there that somebody can use, and I think that maybe that's why I love vampire things, that you can pick up a vampire book and be assured that you're going to see a different vision of the vampire than what you've come across before, or that what you see as your version of vampires is going to be totally different from somebody else's.
Yeah, I really love that about vampires. And when people are always like, oh, it's all been done, I'm like, it hasn't been, though. There's so many different ways you can kind of go through it, and so many different ways you can explore it. So I love vampires.
Oh, I mean, I interviewed an author, Margie Fuston, who wrote Vampires, Hearts and Other Dead Things, and that is also set in New Orleans. And I thought, oh gosh, we're going to have written the same book, but actually hers was this beautiful book about a young woman whose father is dying, and she wants to try and find a vampire to see if that would cure him. And I thought, what a different angle. We've both gone for New Orleans as this kind of vampire center. We're using similar myths, but in a totally different way. And yeah, I just love that. We were drawing from the same pool of ideas and came up with totally different books. It's great. So I was wondering, are there any particular vampire things, although you didn't necessarily draw consciously on them? Like, what are your favorite versions of vampires in popular culture?
Oh, probably the Hammer films. I do love the Christopher Lee, but in particular the first one, Horror of Dracula. That's like my favorite. That was like one of the first ones I ever saw as a kid, and it just was like the one that I like imprinted on. And like I love that one. That's like such a favorite of mine. Again, I love the sets. I love the very melodramatic acting. I love that. I love it's very almost feels like a stage production in a lot of ways. And I just think that's so neat. And Technicolor is so beautiful. Technicolor blood in vampire movies is so beautiful in that era because it's like so bright red and it's just so neat.
It's interesting, isn't it, that you say like your first kind of impression of vampires is the one that stuck. And for me, I think Buffy was when I was like about 12, it came out. And that was, although I'd read Interview with the Vampire totally too young, I think, before then, and I'd read Dracula, probably not understood it. Buffy was kind of the first one that really grabbed me. And I think because I was a teenage girl kind of fighting the teenage girl monsters, and Buffy's doing that, like, I don't know, that was the one. And that's just left its mark because you can see from the room behind me, I've still got all my Buffy stuff. So there's Spike figures, a Buffy figure, a Spike, an angel puppet.
I love it.
Yeah, I'm always happy if somebody enjoys the Buffy stuff behind me. But some vampire stuff, like The Lost Boys, I discovered a little bit later. Like I was born like only a few years before that came out. So obviously you can acquire like new vampire favorites as you go along. But yeah, I think Buffy and The Lost Boys are kind of two of my absolute favorites. I wanted to ask you actually about your vampire mythology. I think one thing I thought was really interesting was how Lucy has an impact and other vampires have an impact on the environment that they're in. I've never seen that done before. I know you bring it in early in the book, so I'm not giving too much away.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that, or is that something from vampire mythology? This idea of if I don't know whether you want to explain it, what I'm talking about to people first, and then just tell me how you came up with the idea because I loved it.
Yeah, so wherever the vampires go, decay follows them. So with Lucy, where she's living, and she's got urns of Dracula, so it's basically like two vampires living there. Just as one day goes by, like dust starts settling more and cobwebs, and they have to keep working on the house to sort of fight back kind of the entropy and the decay that she's bringing with her. I really just got it from the fact that in so many movies and so many different versions, that castles are always so decrepit. Now, the implication is they've just been there so long, and then it just ends up like that. But I thought, what if it just gets like that quickly, and like no matter what they do, they can't stop it. It's just this natural because they're dead. They're like the undead. What if death just is sort of attracted to them? And so that was really where I came from it with, and was like, it seems so natural. Again, like seems like every vampire story I've ever read, or at least a lot of them, certainly not everything, because you bring up Anne Rice, and they always tended to have very nice places. I always think of like the nice places they would live, and that they lived in more opulence. But a lot of vampires do live in decay, and I thought, well, what if that's just something that's attracted to them? And that seemed like so much fun to play with.
Yeah, it was. And I was wondering whether because they've had this prolonged life as well, that's kind of a cost, isn't it? That maybe the living things around them, even like inorganic matter, like the buildings and stuff, like can't cope with this unnaturalness. So yeah, I thought it was really nicely done. I like a vampire myth to kind of recognize the one that I'm familiar with, but then to throw in an extra element there. I thought that was really good. And another thing I loved was the drive-in movie theatre. I thought was such a nice touch of a setting. I was like, in the UK, we don't have those that much. They're sort of creeping in as kind of like sometimes they show outdoor cinema at castles and stuff like that, or at shopping centres they put them on. But where did that come from? Because that was like a really nice moment of nostalgia that isn't even my own nostalgia, but I've obviously acquired from like American films and things. So like, where did that come about from?
So we actually had in the county where I grew up an old drive-in movie theater that's still open to this day. And my dad was just telling me it's like one of the longest continuously open drive-ins, I think, like in the world. And so it was like just this really special, really neat place called the Lynn Drive-In. And I grew, we would go there when I was growing up. You always end up getting eaten by mosquitoes. That's why I put the mosquito coil. There's actually like a little, like back then. I don't think you still have these, but I don't know if they have them still or not because I haven't gone to the drive-in for very, very much in the last 10 years. But you'd put this horrible, like smelly, like mosquito coil and it would like keep them away, I guess. So I used that in the book because those were popular back then for sure. But like they don't have to use it in Reluctant Immortals because no mosquitoes are going to come to them because they're not alive. But it's just a lot of those little things, from the experiences at the drive-in. And I just thought it would be so much fun because back then by the late 60s, drive-ins weren't as popular as they were in like the 50s, but they did still exist. And so I thought it would be fun that was almost like a kind of fading nostalgia even then. And to play with that idea of, we got to know Dracula and got to know Jane Eyre, many of us from the film versions first, and to kind of play on the idea of film and the kind of meta elements of it. And again, I love drive-in, so I thought it would be so much fun to incorporate that as part of the one of the main settings of the book.
Yeah, it was great. And I think that because you're sort of dealing with some dark subject matters, it's nice to have these kind of joyful moments and like these beautiful scenes that just feel like a different, I don't know, like tonally. I imagined it being a film when I was reading it quite often, and I could just imagine these characters like that I'm looking at on screen, looking at their own screen. And yeah, I hope that happens. I don't know whether that's on the cards, but a film or a TV series, certainly. I thought you write really cinematically, and it's sort of like that evocative kind of summer feel and the 60s feel. Like, at what point of your writing process does that happen? Is that an editing thing, or is that quite kind of organic to the way you write?
Probably both. There's probably some of both, trying to get that kind of feel into it right from the beginning. But I think, a lot of great stuff I think happens in editing as a writer. You get a lot, you can kind of fine tune it and see where maybe it's lacking or where you kind of weren't as sort of settled into the world as you got to know it as the book went on. So probably both. I would say some of it I really tried to set up right from the beginning. That way I always think if I can make my life easier in the editing process, I always will try. But I think a lot of things happen once you get into those later drafts.
Yeah, I was wondering, what does your writing process look like? So you've had this great idea. Was it the women that were the initial idea, and then you went from there?
Yeah.
So what did it look like from that point? How did you go from these two great characters that hadn't had their potential utilized? Like, how did you go from there to finished book?
So, I came up with that concept and I just kind of kept thinking about it and how I would want to, where I would want to set it. The 60s setting came next. And then, sort of building on the different ideas and maybe where the settings that I'd want to use and sort of the overall arc. And then I usually have a pretty detailed outline that I'll write ahead of time. So that way I'll know what's going to happen approximately in each chapter. I try not to be too rigid. So if it goes in a different direction, I try to just go in that direction. And then from there, trying to write it. And I do write in order. So it's like in my short stories, I'll write completely out of order. It's like, kind of more of a free for all. But with my novels, I do definitely write like, okay, finish the first chapter, then go to the second chapter. I don't write later chapters because feel like I'll get like lost in all of it. I think novels can be very easy to get lost in as the writer, as the author. And so from there, just getting that first draft, then going back and, really giving it another polish and then sending it to my editor and getting those edits back and then incorporating those. So yeah, this was probably the most fun I've ever had writing a book because I loved the setting. I loved the characters. It's kind of almost like a horror adventure at points because, they're like driving all over California. So it was just really fun. I really enjoyed like the different set pieces and like locales. So it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed writing this one.
Yeah, I think you can tell. I'm becoming convinced that the books that authors love the most tend to be the ones that I enjoy reading the most. It's almost like you've thrown in all the things that you love and had a great time. And I don't know, I've written things in the past maybe where I've like forced it a bit and thought, I'm not sure this is working, but I'm going to go with it. Whereas when I wrote Mina and the Undead, I was like, oh, this is really fun. Oh, I could put this vampire thing in. And before I knew it, I'd sort of written a book. So yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said for writing with your passions. And maybe on that subject, can you tell us a bit about your writing journey, like as a whole? Do you tend to be drawn to similar subjects? Because I think you mentioned this is your third book.
Yeah.
Are there kind of third novel. How many commonalities would you say there are between your books? Like, would people be able to pick one up and say, oh yeah, that's one of Gwendolyn's books?
I think so. There's definitely a lot of female characters, female friendships, search for identity, trying to figure out kind of your place in the world. So my first book was The Rust Maidens. It took place in Cleveland, both in 1980 and then 2008. And it's about these group of girls that actually start turning into the rust and rot of the Rust Belt. And so that one's a lot more like a lot darker, a little less humor than Reluctant Immortal. So there's definitely the difference there. But I do think some of the themes of identity and female friendship are definitely there. And the same thing with my second book, Bones, Set, and Feathers, which is like a fairy tale about witches and witch hunters. And so it's also a lot darker. I think Reluctant Immortals is like the lightest of my three novels. There's a lot more humor. It's kind of, like I said, like a horror adventure. There's a little bit more dark comedy in it. But I would say that, they're all about women trying to find their place. There's, that kind of like magical aspects to it that I think you can see through most of my work.
Do you think that that is how your writing is evolving in terms of the lighter, more comedic, or does that just depend on the book and you kind of change?
I think it just depends on the book, because the next book I wrote is probably the darkest thing I've ever written. So it's like the next one it's about a haunted neighborhood. But like the neighborhood has sort of become a ghost, and these girls who got out before it became a ghost sort of have to face it again. So it's actually very dark. It's probably about as dark, maybe even darker than my first novel, which was pretty dark. So yeah, I think it just depends on the material, because I think Reluctant Immortals was just, it felt like, I was looking at Hammer movies. I was thinking about, the type of Dracula interpretations that I like, and they usually have at least a little bit of dark humor in them. And so that was really kind of the direction I ended up taking that one.
Oh, that's cool. So do you have a publication date for that one, or is that kind of...
No, that one's still very early. I'm not even sure we're going to keep the title I gave it. It's still a working title. So that one's down the road. I don't know. To be determined.
Can you tell us what you're working on right now? Or is that secret? Is that so far down the line that we won't even remember?
I am hoping that the novel after that is going to be a mad scientist novel, female mad scientist set in 1970s second wave feminism. And so I'm describing it as kind of like a sapphic version of David Cronenberg's The Fly. So it's a body horror, and I'm that's the plan. I've been talking about it, and now it'll probably stall out, and the book after that will be something totally different. But that's the one that I'm kind of like working on, in the back of my mind right now.
You have the actual best pitches of books. Like, I think you say 5 words. I'm like, I want it now. Can you just write it, please? That's really good. And I don't know, I don't know how you managed to do this, but all of your books sound like, when you do the one-line pitch of each, and then they're so distinctly you. I hope this is something that I can kind of gather as I've been writing a bit longer. That's really cool. And I don't know, I can see like the progression of your writing and everything. That's awesome. I want to read all of them, so thank you for that. You might have to warn me in advance which one's the super dark ones, and I'll prepare myself. My kind of YA custom brain. So maybe
YA can get pretty dark though too. Some YA
can. Yeah. I mean, people like Dawn Kurtagich, like I kind of sometimes have to put the books down because like, I'm so scared. I need a little break from that. So yeah, I do think I don't know, I think it's just a different kind of scary. It may be like adult horror. I've been talking and thinking about this a lot recently. Like, I think it scares me in a different way, like on a different level. And it's not necessarily deeper or shallower. It's just scaring me about different things. Like, I think adult horror often makes you like look at the person in the mirror and like evaluate yourself and your strengths and weaknesses and your mortality. And I don't know, teenage tends to be like, in terms of like my books and people like that, like that they're battling an actual physical monster, like that you can see, whereas adult, I don't know, that's the way I've interpreted a lot of the stuff I read anyway. But yeah, it's interesting. Maybe I'll try and write an adult one at some point, but I'm just not sure. Like at the moment, I started writing the thing I'm working on now. I thought might be an adult book when I had the idea, and it turned into YA book as soon as the voice came out. I was like, yeah, this is another YA book. So I think for now I'm a YA author. I will just get, wear that mantle. So after the kind of serious questions, my quick fire questions, I just want to ask you, so like quick answers, just whatever comes to your head first. All about vampires, of course. Do you have a favorite vampire?
Probably Dracula or Lucy. Lucy as a vampire. So either one.
Yeah, I like your Lucy actually better than the Dracula of the books Lucy. So I think she needed that extra depth. I don't think Bram Stoker really afforded her that much thought, did he, or time in the book. But anyway, favorite vampire book, is that the same answer?
Probably. Probably. Yeah. We'll probably go with Dracula.
Yeah, no, just thinking there's definitely a theme to yours. Favorite vampire movie? Is it the Hammer horror one that you mentioned?
Probably. Yep. See, it's all Dracula. It's all Dracula all the time.
Okay, what about TV show though? Because I don't know that there's been a big Dracula TV show. Is there a vampire TV show that has your interest?
Yeah, I loved Buffy whenever I was younger. Joss Whedon, I don't like him as a person
Mm,
now, but like it mattered to me a lot. Like I love your Spike stuff back there. I love
thank
Spike. I
you.
was a big Spike fan as a teenager. So it was definitely there, and it definitely was my favorite growing up, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
Yeah, I think Vampire Diaries as well. I was in maybe my late teens when that came out. And yeah, Buffy is the number one, but I did enjoy the Vampire Diaries for what it is. I think it's really fun. And True Blood as well. I thought
I
on
haven't
the
seen
adult
like
line.
many of either of those shows, so like I've mostly just seen Buffy. I should look up the Vampire Diaries and True Blood.
Yeah, try them and just see. I think if you watch the first couple of episodes of both, you'll get the feel of them. But it just shows, like, just in those three TV shows, like the range of material you can cover with vampires.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
it's really great, as hopefully we've demonstrated in our discussion. So I think I'm just going to check my list. If that, I think that is everything that I wanted to touch. Oh, there's one more thing then, and then we'll kind of go to the closing. So writing this book, would you say that there was like a really great thing about writing it, and what was the hardest or worst thing about writing it?
You know, my favorite thing about writing it was just getting to spend time with these characters. I've loved these characters since I was a kid. It just seemed like so much fun. The fact they're in the public domain, to be able to just spend time with them and just explore them and see how I feel that they are, the kind of inner life I wanted them to have. So that was definitely the most fun. And probably the most challenging is, just trying to get it right, trying to create these characters, knowing that you really are working from characters that so many people love and really wanting to do them justice and really trying your best to do them justice. So yeah.
Oh, well, you definitely did do that. And like I said, I think that the extra depth you gave them was just like one of my favorite things about it. I thought that was great. So if that's what you were really going for, then you definitely got it in one, definitely.
Oh, thank you. Thank
And
you
I
so
think
much.
that was maybe a nice place to end. So I really enjoyed talking to you. I feel like we could talk a lot more about vampire stuff, but let's leave it there. So thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I hope you'll pick up Gwendolyn's book. Can you remind us what is the publication date of it?
August 23rd.
Is that in UK and US?
Oh, that is in America. The UK date is in November, I believe.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So we're stretching the beginning and the end of spooky season. That's awesome.
Yes.
So we'll
Yes.
keep your spooky needs going, all that time. And I
Love
feel
it.
really lucky now that I've got to read it like months and months in advance. I'll try not to be too smug. So thank you so much, Gwendolyn. I hope that everyone will check out the book. Thank you for watching. As always, likes and subscribes are very much appreciated. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks.